Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. This is David Brucker, and I'm here to welcome you to our exciting presentation this evening, which is entitled Evidence-Based Strategies to Eliminate ERCP-Related Infections, with our guest speaker, Dr. Hudson Garrett. Quick introduction to Dr. Garrett. Dr. Hudson Garrett is an adjunct associate professor of medicine at the Division of Infectious Diseases at the University of Louisville School of Medicine, and is a faculty member in the Center for Education and Training in Infection Prevention. He served on the FDA's working group for endoscope reprocessing, and Dr. Garrett is a fellow with the Institute of Healthcare Improvement and is a distinguished fellow and practitioner in the National Academies of Practice. He is a board certified in patient safety, healthcare quality, flexible endoscope reprocessing, and infection prevention and control. With that introduction, I welcome Dr. Hudson Garrett. Dr. Garrett, the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Awesome. Thank you very much, and good evening to each of you. And we're so excited to have you join us for this evening. On the right side of your screen, should I say, you'll see a handouts tab that will allow you to download this evening's slides as a PDF file. I did make those in a nice, big, easy to follow format. So if you are like me and your eyes are starting to get a little bit tired, that is available to you. You'll also receive that along with a link to the recording following this evening's presentation. We're really going to talk about three basic things this evening. The first is really around the FDA's 522 study, and specifically, what did that mean for reusable, flexible endoscopes and sort of the potential implications for patient safety. The second is, how do we sort of extrapolate what we should do and what we shouldn't do in this very difficult and frankly sort of unheard of time of COVID-19? And lastly, we're going to focus on sort of what I call the 3 Ps, people, process, and product in that order, to make sure that we have a safe, reliable, and highly effective ERCP procedure. I did want to make sure that I shared with you the important continuing education information for tonight's program. If you are a registered nurse and you are looking to seek your CE credits, this activity is approved through ANCC for 1 contact hour. It is important that you stay on the program for the full amount of time. ANCC only allows you to miss a total of 10 minutes of the activity in order to actually complete your evaluation. You will receive an email from Terry Goodman and Associates within about 72 business hours. Please make sure you check your spam to ensure that that email does not go there. It often does. But if you experience any questions or comments or issues, please feel free to use the email address that's listed there. I would request that, again, you wait those 72 hours before you send an email requesting your information, because we will not be responding to emails until the evaluation has been sent out. Once the eval has been sent out, you complete the eval. At the end of that, there'll be a way for you to download your PDF certificate for your records. Again, this program is accredited for 1 contact hour. Since we're offering continuing education, you can see my disclosures as listed here. And I really want to start with a simple but very important thing, which is a thank you to each of you that are joining us today, despite the very difficult circumstances that we're facing in healthcare across the globe, right? Not just in the GI space, not just in the procedural area, but healthcare in general. And so I want to say thank you to each of you that took the time this evening to, especially time away from your family after a long day of work. We sincerely appreciate the efforts that you're making every single day. And I think that we could agree that one of the things that's been learned in the last 12 months especially is that our healthcare system is broken in many different aspects. There are so many systems and processes, not just associated with medical devices, but frankly, lots of aspects of healthcare that have led us to potential implications for patient harm, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about, the flexible endoscope world this evening, but certainly there are bigger implications when we have process management issues. And so as we think about healthcare in general and how that sort of evolved, there's been a lot of amazing things that have come out in the last 10 to 15 years in this space, right? We've got better procedural technology. We've got more educated physicians. We've got a very educated and specialty workforce with our nurses and our technicians. We have certainly a lot of technology in the form of electronic health records and scheduling things But with all of this comes that potential unintended consequence where maybe we have so much throughput and so much emphasis on flipping that room over that we have challenges associated with reprocessing. Maybe we have environmental contamination. Maybe there's an issue with our process for reprocessing. And so anytime I think of the word reusable, especially between multiple patients, instantaneously in my infectious disease brain, I think about potential risk, right? And so with all these technologies, there's always sort of an approach that can be forced into a one-size-fits-all, if you will. But there certainly is a much more customizable approach and a more personalized blueprint that we can create to ensure that no patient experiences harm, right? And that's really where we get into these different opportunities for improvement. How can we more optimize the system? Can we design better devices? Are there devices, for example, that don't have the risk? Are there processes that we can sort of take the human out of the equation altogether? So I wanted to start with something that I think is really important for the sort of context of our program for tonight, which is what in the world is a medical device? My little brother happens to be a malpractice attorney, which is a very difficult subject, as you can imagine, in my family. But it really sort of teaches me a lot when I have conversations with him, because he sort of brings me back to the realities of what does the verbiage and what does the intended use of that device mean? Right? And so when we think about flexible endoscopes, we know that they're used primarily for diagnosis and treatment of different types of disorders, right, in that GI tract. But we also recognize that there's that potential for a breakdown to take place within the device that may be through improper maintenance, handling, reprocessing, a whole variety of things, as well as manufacturing. And so that legal definition really covers how the FDA classifies each of these devices. And so as a regulated medical device, to us as a clinician, right, that brings a different level of accountability. And with the patient, that brings a different level of risk. And so there's sort of three different ways that I think about challenges related to flexible endoscope reprocessing. And honestly, I think that many of these sort of caveats can be applied across the whole healthcare continuum of care, whether it's a flexible endoscope or something else. But it really boils down to three Ps: people, process, product, in that order, right? You may say, well, why in the world is he starting with people? Well, I think we would all agree if we have the wrong people and the wrong seats on the bus, then we're going to have a problem, right? And so it's really about having highly trained and competent personnel that are doing the right task at the right time. So that's sort of the personnel aspect. And when we look at healthcare, we know there's a lot of turnover, there's a lot of overtime. Certainly with COVID, there's been furloughs. There's a lot of sort of influencers, if you will, that could, make or break this process. The second is all about that, which is our process, right? If I say, go do this process, and I teach 10 people how to do it, and only 9 out of the 10 people actually follow the process to the letter of the law and follow the manual, then what happens with that one patient, that one breach, where there's that sort of potential for cross-contamination or infection, right? So our process has to be reliable, and it needs to be compliant with what those instructions for use are. Now, what I'm going to show you is some data here that's come from multiple different sources collected by the FDA that says with reusable devices, we don't have a very good level of confidence that this is taking place, right? And again, we see this with lots of different things. This is not just related to the GI space. We had the same challenge when we looked at things like intubation with laryngoscopes. We've seen this where the market has moved to disposable blood pressure cuffs as an example. And in some instances, that makes sense, and in others, it doesn't. And so I'm going to also finish this evening with sort of an evidence-based evaluation process to think about what's really the best solution for your patient. And then lastly, it's really getting down to that product level, right? Whether that product is a stapler or something as sophisticated as a flexible endoscope, it doesn't matter. But is that device actually capable of being rendered safe, right? And that's really the key thing here, because a patient, when they come in, yes, the standard of care right now is not sterilization, right? For flexible endoscopes, it's really high-level disinfection. But the patient really has an expectation that that device has no bad microorganisms present in it. And so there is a disconnect between, what the actual expectation of our customers are, what our patients, right? versus what is actually taking place in healthcare facilities. So I wanted to give you a couple of examples that I think will drive home how the needle sometimes moves and how quickly it can move. The first is one that has affected, unfortunately, thousands of people, where when you look at, folks that are diabetic and they use an insulin pen, and of course they need to check their blood sugar, right? And so on the left, you can see a device that's a lancing device that's designed for multiple patient use, right? That is going to be used between multiple patients, that needs to be disinfected between patient usage. You can see a little bit of a trend here. But the challenge is that these devices, the ones that are pictured here, if you will, are only designed for one single patient to use, right? So they were never designed for use in healthcare where they would be used between patient A, patient B, patient C, et cetera. And so there was a design issue associated with this. And unfortunately, what took place is that certain facilities like nursing homes actually reused these devices that were never intended for that purpose and transmitted hepatitis B and HIV between patients, right? And so that was one issue. The second one I want to bring your attention to is getting closer to our flexible endoscope analogy, right? And this is an actual ultrasound probe that's being used, you can see, on intact skin. Well, if you think about the spotting classification, this is intact skin. This is a medical device. So theoretically, this is what we would refer to as that non-critical device. The needed level of disinfection here is a minimum of low-level disinfection. But of course, that could change if there's any type of break in the patient's skin, right? The same is true when we think about flexible endoscopes. If we're passing devices, especially sterile devices, through those endoscopes, we're now introducing something that's sterile through a non-sterile device, as an example. And so we have sort of a mismatch. And so we've seen, again, now two different examples where contamination can occur when we don't have the right level of reprocessing or disinfection possible. And a third and final example I want to give you is one that's quite unfortunate, but is very, very relevant to our conversation today, which is, I call it sort of the CSI, that crime scene investigation of infectious disease. This was really the first time in my career where I saw the CDC and the FDA be able to directly trace back a medical device outbreak to the manufacturing process that took place in a whole other country genetically. And so this is a heater cooler unit that's used for open heart procedures that, unfortunately, during the manufacturing process, there was innate contamination that was introduced into the device that then was being essentially circulated into the air in the operating room, right? And so again, we have these devices that are designed to do awesome things, right, in both diagnostic and therapeutic purposes, but unfortunately, due to a wide variety of issues, actually led to potential contamination. So this sort of leads us to where we are today, right? Basic things like if you go and get your flu shot and you expect that that needle and syringe is sterile, right? You expect that it's used only for you. Well, patients had the same expectations for many medical devices like flexible endoscopes in order to determine that, hey, if I'm going in for especially an elective procedure, I certainly don't want to go home with a CRE infection or a Pseudomonas infection or something else that's going to potentially make me very, very ill, or in the worst possible scenario, actually take my life, right? And so again, it's all about the perception of the patient and what can we do to make sure we're matching that with the appropriate level of safe reprocessing or usage of a device. So the FDA, knowing all of this and looking at these many different examples that I've showed you, said, hey, we've got to come up with a better sort of mousetrap to better evaluate design challenges related to medical devices. And so they looked at things like channels and hinges, and O-rings was a big one, and valves. And they said, well, if we have these types of risk factors in the actual device design, then we know that there's going to be an exponential increased risk to the patient, right? There's also going to be a decreased susceptibility, if you will, that these devices can be properly cleaned in many instances. But they wanted to evaluate this and say, is this really true in a clinical setting, right? Because keep in mind that manufacturers of reusable endoscopes are doing validation to say, can the device be reprocessed according to the manufacturer's instructions for use, right? So that's going to be done in a controlled setting, but never before recently was this ever validated with actual people like us, right? To say, hey, if I train a group of nurses and techs and I give them a standardized way of training, does this actually get me to a better outcome? Am I more consistent? Am I actually going to produce a safer device and render it more safe, right? And so again, we're looking at design challenges. Now let's sort of layer in a different set of granularity, right? There's this concept called human factors engineering, right? And it's a fancy term that essentially says if I give somebody a standardized set of training in a standardized way, and I validate that, can they produce the same outcome reliably, right? So if we apply that to a flexible endoscope, let's say that there's 300 steps to reprocess that endoscope, and I give that same training. Let's say it's a week long, how long it may be, and I give that to 10 people, 5 nurses and 5 techs from across the country with different backgrounds, but I give them the same set of training. Can they consistently and reliably actually reprocess the device, and is it compliant with the manufacturer's instructions for use, right? So this is, again, that sense of reliability. Now, there's also that potential risk that things that we might do might alter the device. You know, one example is putting things that are not approved through the device. So like a snare or some type of forcep or something that may actually damage the device. There's also that concept of third-party repair, which we see a lot of now in healthcare, not just with endoscopes, but with lots of different medical devices where, you know, people come in and they sell you this sort of bill of goods that, hey, we'll take cost out, we'll do the same level of repair, but it's very different when it's not the manufacturer and they don't have manufacturer parts and they're using third-party parts, right? This can actually adulterate the device or change its intended functionality and actually render it very, very dangerous. You know, the same could be true for things like brushes. You know, looking at things like toothbrushes that are used as an example, or using an incompatible detergent or disinfectant that actually may cause a biofilm to adhere. For example, on the actual device itself. So those are always possibilities as well. Now, you know, unfortunately, there's been lots of different incidences within the news that are specific to contamination related to these semi-critical devices. Because keep in mind that these flexible endoscopes are currently classified as semi-critical medical devices. And so these are just a few examples that I picked that are very pertinent to tonight's conversation, because devices have risk inherently, just like any medical procedure. Even if you go to the doctor's office and get a flu shot, there's always a risk, right? What we're trying to do is say, does the risk, you know, get outweighed by the potential clinical benefit? That's what we're actually trying to accomplish. If we can't say that, then it's really not a very good example of patient safety. But you can see sort of 2 different examples. One at the top here is related to a gastroscope where 1,000 patients had to be notified because there was a breach in handling, right, and reprocessing. The staff did not follow that. And on the bottom, you can see a sort of tangential example where somebody was not properly discarding single-use needles and syringes, right? And again, that's a very scary situation, but imagine if you're a patient and you go in for you know, a simple elective GI procedure, and a month later you get a phone call, or a week later you get a phone call. Hey, Hudson, we need you to report back to the hospital or your local healthcare provider. There's a chance you've been exposed to a device that was breached. They did not properly reprocess it, and we're going to need to test you for the next year for hepatitis B and HIV and a whole host of other things. As you can imagine, that's not a good day for anybody involved. So as I mentioned earlier, the FDA then said, well, we need to better understand this, right? How do we actually identify, is this a true risk? And does this happen in actual healthcare facilities? It's one thing for manufacturers to test this in labs and do this in conference centers and stuff like that, but it's a whole different animal to actually do this in a hospital or an ASC to determine whether or not this truly takes place. And so from this came this concept of a 522 study, right? And the 522 study essentially had 2 simple goals. Number 1 was, could they actually reprocess devices correctly, right? And if they did, then what was left behind from a microbe standpoint? Was there anything potentially pathogenic that was going to cause human infection? So again, we're looking at sort of part A, human factors. Part B was the microorganism survivability post-reprocessing according to the manufacturer's instructions for use, right? So again, we're trying to follow those manufacturer's instructions for use. So they then broke this down and said there's sort of really two basic categories, high concern and low to moderate. High concern are the things that absolutely are going to cause a human patient an infection risk, right? Things that CRE, Pseudomonas, E. coli, that type of stuff. And then those low to moderate concern organisms were ones that there's always that potential for harm, but it's most likely related to some form of contamination, right? And so again, the FDA was looking at this, and then they also identified if you had over 100 colony forming units of a lower moderate concern, that was also problematic. So, this is important because it tells us, hey, after reprocessing, according to the manufacturer's instructions for use for reusable flexible devices, what's left behind, right? Because I'll tell you, sitting in these meetings, FDA's thought was there will be 0 high concern pathogens. Well, just wait till you see the data, right? So here's sort of a breakdown of what that data looks like. And you can see here, broken down by the 3 medical manufacturers. You can see the sort of high concern organisms versus the low to moderate. And you can see that the statistics are all over the map, all the way up to 5%. Again, FDA's expectation was that they would find 0 high concern organisms. Well, let's think about that in terms of the spotting classification. If I'm just doing high-level disinfection, I'm not eliminating all forms of microorganisms, right? So there's going to be something left behind. Now, certainly we hope it's not going to be in a substantial quantity to cause infection, but we can't predict that. We can't go off of that, sort of hunch, if you will, alone. So this tells us that with these reusable devices, there is that risk associated with those, even when they're properly reprocessed according to the manufacturer's instructions for use. Now, in life, when we get up every single day, we have 2 choices. We can either be reactive, which unfortunately is so much of what we do in healthcare because we're thrown lots of different sort of obstacles, or we can actually spend our time trying to be as proactive as possible. For myself, I like to live on the proactive side of the equation as much as I can. Now, certainly life throws wrenches in there, but if we sort of stop the organism and the contamination from ever becoming an issue, then we never get into the side of the equation where we actually have to recognize the infection, treat the infection, deal with the lawsuits, deal with the PR nightmare, all of those types of things. And so again, we can spend a lot of time if we do the work up front to identify the risk, mitigate those risks, and determine what the best approach for our facility might be. So there are some questions to consider that will help us reduce the potential for contamination, right? Some of this is based on device design. Other pieces of this are actually based on, the similarity of things like the IFU, the training process, et cetera. But for example, can we make the things more similar, where there's not a lot of inconsistency in the different types of reprocessing across device families? So maybe you have 2 different types of gastroscopes. Can they be similar to an ERCP, for example? Can they be similar to a bronch? How cleanable are these things? Can we actually get them clean? And I will tell you that that's one piece, but being able to see the surfaces is a whole different animal, right? So if you're using a borescope, for example, I always sort of joke and say using a borescope is like teaching somebody how to read a chest x-ray without them understanding the anatomy of the chest. And so a borescope is a great tool, but we have to know how to use it and what is normal versus what is not normal in order to really make a good dent in patient safety impact here. And even some of the manufacturers have not fully appreciated what normal versus not normal is. And so a lot of times they'll just say, let's replace those parts that might seem to be negatively impacted. Also from an accessibility standpoint, can we do some type of visual inspection? Is there something that will tell us if we've actually been successful? Similar to the concept of a biological indicator when we run a load for sterilization, that will tell us that everything in that load is dead. Is there a way for us to determine whether HLD, sterilization, or if it's a single-use device, that device is still safe in order to use for that next patient, right? To be able to show a patient that is huge. I know even when I go for my own flu shot, I make them draw that medication up right in front of me. They probably think I'm crazy, but I want to make sure that that needle and that syringe and that vial was only used on me. And so again, patients are starting to get a lot more educated about this topic. And so we want to make sure we can do everything in our power to reduce that risk for contamination. Now, certainly one aspect of what FDA's work has been focused on is really making sure that manufacturers are actually designing the device for its intended use, right? And I'm going to tell you to take it a step further and say also for the intended audience, because we know that the audience that handles these devices is going to be very variable. And so maybe I think about sort of the clinical world where I've got my nurses, my techs, my physicians. I may have biomedical engineering involved in this process. Purchasing may be involved. Folks that might be doing some type of maintenance. I may have different levels of reprocessing staff. And so again, when I think about this from a human factor standpoint, I have to consider all these potential variables. Where is the risk going to be introduced into the equation? Again, this is for reusable devices, right? And so again, it may make sense to think about what are alternatives? What are things that I can do to mitigate risk, eliminate risk, take people out of the equation? I had somebody tell me one time, they're like, you're just trying to take my job by eliminating me from the equation. And I said, absolutely not, right? Let's reallocate you to a better purpose. There's no reason that we should have humans that are going to be very sort of inconsistent in their approach for important steps like pre-cleaning and manual cleaning, where we know that that is going to be sort of the determinant as to whether or not that sterilization or HLD process is going to be effective. So if we sort of go back to those design elements that are prone, right, to retaining biological material, I want to focus in for a second on O-rings, right? O-rings have been implicated in multiple outbreaks associated with flexible endoscopes, right? Stuff gets trapped under there. They start to not hold their sort of weight there. The epoxy can come off, the glue can come off. Certainly you've got now a long dark tube that you can't see inside. So it's not like you have the ability to have a glass house where you can see all of the streaks on the windows. We don't have that ability with endoscopes. And so the ability to identify rapidly whether something is right or wrong is really not present there in most circumstances. And you've got lots of nooks and crannies and channels and angles and all kinds of things that can make it extremely difficult to not only clean, but also to actually see. And again, my philosophy is if I can't see it, I can't clean it. If I can't clean it, I can't disinfect it. And if I can't disinfect it, I can't make it safe for the actual patient. So there's a lot of ways that debris can get stuck down in there. So, we talked earlier about sort of the use of a third party. There's also sort of adaptations and changes that might be made by those third parties that can, again, adulterate the device that may change the way that it performs or functions. Using additional parts that are not used or validated in there can be a problem. Certainly not letting manufacturers know when that takes place. This is always a big issue. And then certainly, lastly, if you will, we've got to make sure we do a better job of evaluating these devices for their intended purpose to ensure we get input from all the relevant audiences, we do a good clinical trial, and then we think about how do we implement this type of device within our unique sort of health system. It's fine and dandy to have sort of a template and a rollout plan, but we all know that every single facility is slightly different. And so we have to take into consideration that, as well as the servicing options. How often does this device need to be serviced? Who needs to service it? What do we do if we need a loaner device, for example? And where's that loaner device been? That's one thing that sort of stuck out with me over the years with outbreak investigations is, healthcare facilities would have an outbreak and it would be associated with a loaner from the manufacturer. And they would have absolutely no clue the history of that loaner, where it came from, the last time it was serviced, how often it's been disinfected, have there been any other issues with it, because it was not their device. And so there's all these different issues that might creep up with this. I wanted to give you one example that it always makes me laugh, which is the all-fashioned disposable blood pressure cuff. And you can notice that it's wrapped around the bed rail at the foot of the bed. Which is really not a great spot for contamination purposes, right? And so what we think we're doing is creating a reduced risk or an elimination of risk by having a single blood pressure cuff for one patient. But what we've actually done in reality is actually stick it at one of the most contaminated areas within the patient room. So the reason I bring this up is that it doesn't matter if it's reusable, disposable, sterile, not, HLD, it doesn't matter. There's always going to be risk if we don't properly use something. And so following the manufacturer's instructions for use is and still remains one of the most critical elements that we can do to ensuring the safety of the care that we're providing for our patients. So let's talk for a second about maintenance. This is a big area that if you look at the MAW database that FDA tracks adverse events, you'll find a lot of clarity in there about the known risk associated with lack of maintenance and proper maintenance, especially around ERCPs. There has been a big push over the last few years to have a scheduled set of maintenance for reusable duodenoscopes for good reason, right? Because previously there was no maintenance schedule that said you need to send it in every 6 months or a year. Here's the things to look for wear and tear. None of that really existed. And so that prevented us from knowingly being able to use that device safely, right? And how do we sort of judge the effectiveness of a reprocessing? I'm going to give you a couple examples here in a moment about that. And then lastly is how do I sort of measure, am I doing the steps for reprocessing correctly in the first place? Compared to what the IFUs have said. And all too often when I ask people, I said, when's the last time you were actually trained by the manufacturer on reprocessing? And they'll normally say at the time that we bought the devices, the time that we bought the scopes, right? And that's not a good situation because we want to treat this like an annual competency. We want to make sure that people are all, really going to be trained at the time of hire, anytime something changes, and then at least once annually as part of their annual competency. But we want to also document that there is an adherence to this and there's regular review and sort of oversight of this process, because in a lawsuit, they're going to ask you, when's the last time you were trained? Who trained you? Show me the in-service form. How long was the training? Was there a teach back? Did they actually watch that person reprocess that device? How often did they do that? Has this been validated annually? Oh, I see you just changed your scope. Have you been re-in-serviced? And a lot of times in court, people say, oh my gosh, I didn't think about that, right? So following the manufacturer's instructions is one of the most steadfast way to reduce risk to patients. So if we apply that to human factors, right, it's all about sort of designing systems that will be set up for success. Part of that is us as leaders and supervisors to make sure we're providing proper oversight and resourcing. We want to make sure that the environment itself is safe, so that we can actually provide feedback and get feedback back. We can stop the line if there's any potential issue related to a contamination. That's one of the big things that we don't see a lot of in healthcare, the power to actually stop the line and stop procedures. If I walk into a hospital and they say, we believe in patient safety so much so that we are all empowered to stop any unsafe event. My next question will be, okay, so let's just set this up. Your top performing surgeon, your top grossing surgeon has just committed a absolute negligent act that's putting a patient at risk. Do you have the power to shut down his OR, or do you have to call someone? And 90% of people say, I have to call my supervisor. Well, then no, you don't really have a culture of safety that's led from the very top. Because if that was the case, your leadership, your CEO would say, anywhere you see an unsafe act in progress, you stop it immediately and we will deal with the consequences after the fact. Right? It's not about politics. It's not about titles. It's not about, what's after your name. It's really all about putting the patient first. And that really starts with leadership and oversight. And then at the very bottom, it's also about making sure that each individual involved in the process, whether it's purchasing, reprocessing, the physician that's handling the device, the nurse that's, doing the bedside cleaning, for example, they've got the right amount of training in order to properly do that. So, we certainly see lots of turnover. We see changes in equipment. Certainly over the last 12 months, I'm sure many of you have experienced the same thing I have, where I've had, 50 different types of gloves. We've had different types of gauze. Every excuse is it's due to COVID. I'm so sick of hearing that. But every excuse with supplies is we can't get it because of COVID. And so there's certainly always that sort of mismatch with supply. There's then also the haphazard event where we don't have vendor reps in our facilities that are able to train us. So some of you have started redoing that. I know at least one of my facilities, we will let certain ones in, but not all. But again, we're trying to go back to ensuring that all of our staff are properly trained, right? And if we've learned anything from the pandemic, it really has taught us, I hope, a lot about collaboration and the need to have sort of an open dialogue about preparedness. And the same is true with medical devices. It is absolutely crazy to me that we have shut down healthcare for so long with a virus that we could absolutely control, right? Now, certainly if we don't have PPE available, stuff like that, that is a whole different animal, but we really didn't have any fear of how the virus was transmitted for a very long period of time, and yet many facilities were still not doing procedures. And so this has put patients at harm because it really sort of held back. And I'm very nervous to see sort of the cancer, the screening, all of the different indicators of long livelihood as to what those are going to be post-pandemic. So if we think about sort of basic infection control mechanisms related to medical devices, we talked earlier a little bit about the spotting classification, right? And so what we're trying to do is think about the intended use of that device. Is it something that's going to go into a sterile body cavity and be considered a critical device that requires sterilization? Is it more like the current endoscopes are viewed as semi-critical devices that come in contact with mucous membranes and require a minimum of high-level disinfection? Or is it something like a blood pressure cuff, right? That is a non-critical item that's going to come in contact with intact skin and require a minimum of low-level disinfection. Now, you probably heard a lot of emphasis at the society level with the clinical societies about, moving endoscopes up from the semi-critical classification to the critical and requiring sterilization. I will give you an example that I think will put things in perspective. I had a friend that worked at a hospital, and she called me one day, this was several years ago, and she said, I need to ask you a question for the record. And I thought, this is not good. This is a very bad start to the conversation. And she said, how would you feel if you had an instrument set that came up to the OR and it had a dead lizard in it that had run through the entire sterilization cycle, and the staff told you that it didn't matter because the instrument set was completely sterile because it passed the biological indicator, right? And I had to sort of pause, catch my breath, regroup my head, and say, so let me get this straight. There was a dead sterile lizard in the instrument set, and somebody said that it was okay to use that. And they said yes. And I thought, what in the world have we come to here from this perspective? And so regardless of how the device is reprocessed, if it's not handled and treated appropriately, it doesn't matter. So I can take a sterile device and contaminate it simply by nature of not properly handling it, right? So, again, sterility is always the way to go when it's available, but we also have to make sure we protect the benefits of sterility as well. And then when you think about sort of that principles of cleaning and disinfection, those are really designed to sort of, remove the muck, the bioburden, and specifically cleaning, and make that device ready for whatever level disinfection. In this case, it would have been HLD. But again, you're seeing a lot of movement in the clinical societies and in the peer-reviewed literature to think about flexible endoscopes not as semi-critical, but really to move it up a notch because of the known associated risk with infection. So the FDA sort of said, hey, we've got a problem here, right? We've got data that suggests this is bad. We've got adverse events that says we've got a problem. We've got, lawsuits out there. And so they put out a safety alert that basically said we need to look at transitioning to duodenoscopes with disposable components. And then they took that a step further and really drilled down a little bit deeper into sort of what is really the best possible solution long term. And what I really liked about this comment was it sort of gave facilities a stepwise approach based on where they were in their current journey. So for example, if they were using 10-year-old devices that had never been serviced and they had issues with their HLD, with their AER, then that's where they need to start. Versus facilities that may already be doing a great job with HLD, what is sort of that next level? Is that a disposable device? Is that sterility? Is it monitoring of the process? And so, they talked about things about sort of rendering the reprocessing device unnecessary, if you will, right? And so again, this is an example of how we can sort of make that transition. Now, they put out what they call their 6 criteria for reprocessing, and I'll tell you, I got a good laugh out of this because some of these are a little bit of oxymorons. And I'll share with you what I mean here in just a second. We've already talked about the intended use. We've talked about how those devices should be cleaned and by what process, whether it's HLD, sterilization, or disposable. But here's where I really get a laugh, right? The instruction should be technically feasible, comprehensible but understandable. So let me give you an example. So let's say you have a disposable device. Well, guess what? There's no reprocessing instructions. So I don't have to validate that. I just throw it in the trash. There's no training required because I don't have to reprocess it, versus a reusable device that might have anywhere from 150 to 300 steps that could require up to an hour from start to finish. And so is it reliable and safe for me to have a reprocessing technician to do all of those steps without any visual aids, without any actual oversight, without the ability to actually see those steps? I don't know about you, but over the last 12 months, I can barely remember what I did yesterday, much less focus on 150 to 300 steps. And so we've got to figure out ways to make things extremely user-proof and bring it down to the level of the least common denominator for patient safety. So from that, there's really 4 different ways that I can think about in my brain as to how do we get there, right? How do we get to that point of true patient safety? The first is to look at the devices that were already out there. And so pretty much everybody's done this, where the different reusable manufacturers said, we got to strengthen our product, we got to make it better based on this data of contamination. The second piece that FDA called out in their safety alert was, what do we do about high-risk components like the elevators, right? Those distal ends and the elevator channels where we know that there's been recovered microorganism that's problematic. And then can we change how we reprocess these devices with things like new novel sterilization that doesn't break down the device? And stage 4, again, is getting us to that penultimate way of total elimination of contamination risk, which is a completely disposable sterile solution, right? And again, every facility is going to be in a different place in this journey. If I were to say, what do I spend money on? I would definitely not spend money on disposable blood pressure cuffs, which have never been implicated in outbreaks. I would certainly think about things like laryngoscopes that have been implicated, bronchoscopes which have been implicated, duodenoscopes which have been implicated, ureteroscopes. There's a lot of different devices out there that we have data that have been tied back to actual human infection. So, there's certainly a big impetus and push, rightfully so, on manufacturers to say, design better devices at better cost that are going to deliver upon our promise for safety and efficacy and the ability to treat these patients. But there's certainly a responsibility for each of us at that healthcare facility level about making sure we're monitoring for competency and training, that we're following the IFUs, that we're documenting that information, that we're maintaining those devices according to the manufacturer's instructions. For example, with duodenoscopes that are used for ERCPs, if they're out on the market now, the FDA requires a once-a-year manufacturer-performed maintenance process. And so this is something that's fairly new. It's great, but again, I want to make sure that I have control over my own destiny. What can I do to make sure that I don't have to rely on anyone else to tell me if my device is safe? And then with that, with any of these reusable devices, I've got to have a good policy in place for driving competency, right? Again, at the time of hire, anytime something changes, and at least annually. And it's got to cover basic things like personal protective equipment. What do I do if this happens? How do I inspect the device? And certainly I'm a major fan of supporting board certification, right? I totally recognize that cost and money is very tight right now within facilities, but we do know, and there's a lot of good data from many different specialties that says, folks that are board certified do typically produce a better outcome, right? That's not a one size fits all. And I certainly don't want to discount the excellent colleagues that may not be board certified. But I will tell you, as a hiring manager of many years, if I have 2 equally qualified candidates and their resumes are sitting on my desk for the same job, I'm going to hire the person that's certified any day of the week over the person that's not, because it does signal to me that that person is taking an increased level of accountability in their own professional development. Now, I like this graphic because it sort of reminds me visually of all of the points of access where harm could be introduced, right? So let's say we do a great job of bedside cleaning, we do good manual cleaning, we get it into AER, it goes through HLD, it passes, it's rinsed successfully, but then we store it in a contaminated scope cabinet with black mold, which I've seen. That's going to create a problem. Or we then handle that HLD scope and we handle it with bare hands that are contaminated and then carry it down the hall with water dripping on the floor, et cetera. You can see where I'm going with this. What about, situations where we have emergency procedures, where a team is called in and maybe there's not somebody there that is actually called in to reprocess. Maybe it's only a nurse and the physician and anesthesia that are called in, as an example. We don't have anybody there to reprocess. It's really not a good idea to ask people to reprocess that are not trained and are also not doing this on a regular basis. One of the scariest things that I heard one day was, having a resident or a fellow do this on the weekends. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, you're asking for a lawsuit because these are folks that are not going to be well trained. They're not going to do it with the frequency that they need. And there's zero oversight for us to sort of monitor the process. Now, we're living in this very tense and unique world right now that I am praying, as of I'm sure all of us are, that COVID-19 will move along. But this has brought up a lot of sort of questions about what do I do with these novel viruses and pathogens? And luckily with COVID, it's a very easily inactivated virus. And so all of our HLD, all of our sterilization cycles are going to take care of this with no issue at all. It's a pretty easy virus to kill on the environmental surfaces and medical devices. But what I will say is that, again, I think there are many ways for us to not go through this lack of clinical continuity of care with future pandemics. I've seen so many people that have had heart attacks or strokes or cancer diagnoses that were missed or delayed because they simply didn't feel comfortable coming in to get care. And so anything that we can do to reduce the risk to the patient, but also reduce the risk to us, is going to be, I think, a very welcome conversation as we have that with patients. And a lot of this starts with a very multidisciplinary approach to ensuring we have the right people at sort of the table, right? Materials management, our biomed folks, our human factors engineers, infection prevention, risk management, patient safety, because they're going to be the ones that are going to provide input not only into sort of the assessment of the device at time of evaluation and implementation, but also need to be familiar with the device in case something happens. What you do not want to do is have a conversation with your infection preventionist when the outbreak is taking place, right? And you've got 50 patients that you now have to notify and the news media is outside. That's really not the best way to build a relationship with your IP. And so it's something to think about. So when we think about sort of a comprehensive device hygiene or an infection prevention strategy, there's lots of different elements that we could choose, right? We could have good, reasonable instructions for use. We could think about human factors validation. We could have a better mousetrap with HLD. We could look at device sterilization, and certainly we could look at even a single-use device if that's what makes sense, right? All of these come with benefits and potentially risk, right? So even if I look at a device sterilization, if I then contaminate the sterile device, well, then I just shot myself in the foot, and I just sort of ruined the principles of sterilization that bring that low level of risk to the equation, because there's no contamination that's present on the device. And so if we put the patient at the center for everything that we do, right, and we bring all the different players, whether it's the FDA, healthcare societies, accreditation bodies, third parties, the manufacturers of the endoscopes themselves, it all has to be centered around the patient, right? Because what we're trying to do is build a safety net that, despite multiple potential risks, we're going to mitigate those out so that they never, ever risk the patient. I sort of think about this as the fencing technology, right? Put up multiple fence, supercharge them with electricity so that no harm ever reaches the patient, right? And that's all we're trying to do in the world of flexible endoscopes. And there's a couple tools, one of which that I particularly like is the CDC CMS tool here that's specific for medical devices. This is actually what surveyors are using to assess your competency, your practice, as well as your program. And so my recommendation is to print this off, and you can actually do this on a quarterly or monthly basis and walk through your suite and actually go through the checklist, see what the obstacles are, look for potential risk, evaluate for harm. And I think this gives us a great starting point, not only to get on the same page as our regulatory and accreditation bodies, but really most importantly is to actually see things through a different lens that might help protect the patient. And finally, a couple closing comments. I love this sort of concept because when we think about reusable devices, we need to monitor, we have to have that sort of watchful eagle eye, if you will, that is looking for potential harm, potential breaches, has the ability to rapidly intervene, right? And so the most simple way to do that is a simple visual observation, right? I'm going to watch the process. I'm going to hope that I remember it well enough in order to determine whether or not, so-and-so is doing it correctly. Then there's that concept of ATP validation. And ATP is a great tool, but it only measures cleanliness. It's not going to tell me anything beyond that. So if I'm looking for a good indicator for, following manual cleaning, then this is okay. But I will tell you, and FDA's put out warnings about this, using this in sort of a larger context. We have to be very careful about that because it doesn't tell me what's on there. And ATP also looks at the presence of currently living microorganisms, but also recently dead. And so there's always that potential risk. And it's not going to tell me if it's bacteria, viruses, any of that stuff. So it's just a simple measure of cleanliness. Now, if you want to go a step above that, we do have the ability to do microbiological culturing, right? And this is pretty risky because you can have issues with contamination. You need to have an environmental lab, so this should not be done by your hospital lab, preferably. And you're going to see a lot. I've seen at least 3 or 4 rapid technologies that are currently going through the FDA process that will hopefully help us identify breaches more quickly, similar to a biological indicator. Even for sterile products, I would love to see concepts like this where you can look at the package and determine that the package is still sterile. Right now, yes, it needs to be sealed and all that kind of stuff, but almost like the Duracell battery or the Energizer battery, where you can press the power meter and it tells you if that battery is fully charged. I want to know that my sterile medical devices are also still sterile. So I could do a visual inspection, make sure my packaging is intact. I can make sure it's within date. I can ensure that it's not contaminated with water or other fluids, right? Because these are all implications to public health that may or may not have to be reported. And so this is just an example of a checklist that I actually borrowed from CDC that looks at sort of red flag technologies that we have to be aware of, right? On the left, you'll see some elements to avoid like fans, but the one I want to draw our attention into is the elements of concern there in the middle. Now, if you look at this, you may say, well, wow, this is pretty much all endoscopes. Well, bingo, you got it. Right? So having water, moisture retention, you can't see inside, inaccessible compartments, complex cleaning instructions, right? Human variability. These are all risks that we have to think about. And they're not saying you can't do them, but you need to do them with extreme caution, right? And so there are different ways for us to sort of, deal with this. So if we think about what we've talked about this evening, right, hopefully a lot of good content that reminds us of a common sense approach to what we can do to reduce risk, right? Focusing on people, process, and product, making sure that we're using the most appropriate mousetrap for our patient population and that we're measuring success, right? And so with any reusable device, we know that there's that increased inherent risk, because it's got to be properly reprocessed, maintained. I've got to store it correctly. I need to handle it and bring it to the room correctly. That does not necessarily exist with disposable, right? If I've got a disposable device, in the world of disposables, there's non-sterile and sterile. If I have a sterile disposable device that's single use, then that's going to eliminate that risk for microcontamination, right? So I'm not going to have that cross-contamination that's going to exist there. It's also going to help me free up those personnel that we already knew through the FDA study were not properly performing this consistently, right? And by no means is that a slap in the face of our excellent reprocessing colleagues, because the system was never designed to be set up for success, right? Expecting a human being to do 300 steps without some type of job aid is crazy, right? There's no way that we could ensure safety associated with that. And so that variability in reprocessing is going to be always certainly a potential risk for cross-contamination. And so we want to think about that as well. Now, lastly, we also want to think about devices that might be reusable that could be potentially repurposed as single use. And this happens a lot in the perioperative space. And so specifically with reusable devices or ones that are labeled for single use and then reprocessed, we see this all the time where they're not properly inspected. And so again, our goal should be to think about disposable devices or disposable solutions or sterilization in order to get us to the biggest endpoint here. So as a reminder, here's the contact information for continuing education. I would encourage you to, again, download the slides that are available on the right side of your screen. If for whatever reason you're able to download those, you're on your phone tonight, driving home, or iPad, I will be sending out a copy of the slides to you as well. so that you'll have access to that. And if there's any tools or resources that you're interested in or that you need more help with, I'm going to place my email address up here for you to see. And that way you can reach out to me. I always welcome any questions or comments. But hopefully tonight's presentation was helpful to you to think about, again, different ways for us to skin the cat associated with that. So it looks like we have a couple.
This is David. First of all, great presentation. Let's just ask if there's any questions from the group that they go online and enter their question in the chat box. That'd be great. But one question I do have for you in regards to the scope of this topic, it's relatively large within a hospital system. Is the chief medical officer a good call point in regards to trying to move away and eliminate the risk and maybe go single use? Is that a good person to maybe drive the conversation, bring to them the awareness around this topic? What are your thoughts?
I mean, I think there's a variety of different people that, internally you would want to talk to. The infection preventionist is really the keeper of the infection prevention and control program. Certainly the GI nurse manager and the chief of GI are people that are going to have a very strongly vested interest in this. But honestly, a lot of places are looking at this topic based on risk management. And so, having a conversation internally, I know it looks like we have a majority of nurses on the call tonight, it looks like, having a conversation with your healthcare risk manager is probably going to be the best way to go and to sort of have that sort of introductory piece and also create institutional data. I think that's another piece that people forget a lot about. It's great to look in the literature, it's great to look in societal guidelines, but create your own data. If you have evidence of outbreaks or evidence of verification failures, or you're constantly having issues with your AER, then that's something that you should be taking to your leadership team internally, specifically the CFO, to have conversations about that.
Great, thank you.
So it looks like we have a couple of other questions in the chat box. The next one came from Eileen. And it was about, you mentioned ATP for cleanliness verification of scope reprocessing. How about channel check? So, channel check's another great one. I'm glad that you brought that up, and that's just for, one particular product. What those help us do is detect the presence of contamination, bioburden, or protein that's left behind. Any of those things is bad, right? So if I have a manually reprocessed scope and I've still got gunk left behind that I can see, that's bad. This is really going to help us determine some of the stuff that we can't see. But I will tell you that there's also some nuances with things like ATP where you can have repeated failures. And so I would encourage us to make sure that we're using solutions that have been validated for that specific intent. And if you go back to your point, Eileen, about the ATP as an example, FDA put out about a year ago a safety alert on duodenoscopes, and in that safety alert, they specifically called out ATP and said you need to be very careful because these products are not approved for this intended use and they're not tested for such. So, with each of them, there's sort of a pro and con list, and I would encourage us to look at both the manufacturer provided information and also ask for peer-reviewed publications or external validation that says that works. But any of those will be helpful. And frankly, I'm a big fan of using sort of a multimodal strategy. If you can use a couple different ways to skin the cat to give us a higher degree of confidence, and that applies even if you're using a single-use device. Because again, going back to my example of needles and syringes, right? Those have been forever, right? Single-use, sterile, disposable, and yet we still have reuse of needles and syringes in the United States almost every week, reported to CDC. So it always goes back to proper usage is going to be important. Looks like the next question came in is do you advise that we not let physicians reprocess scopes? I've had an issue with that. As a CNS, I am worried about this practice because they don't have the solid amount of training that our nurses and techs do. So I think your sort of question is twofold. One is if they don't have the same level of training and the same level of accountability as your team does, then they should have no business reprocessing that device. And two, I ask, is that really the best use of their time? I think that's something that we've got to think about. And that's what I always go back to. If you're making a change and let's say you're automating a process or you're going to disposable, whatever it is, people say, well, what do I do with those people? Well, there's plenty of stuff we can get them to do in healthcare, right? We are very busy in healthcare, so we can always reallocate them, but never ever do we want to make exceptions to competency for reprocessing, because that is where you're going to create a massive lawsuit and liability associated with that. So I think that that's another important one. The next question came in is, I've heard a lot about AAMI changing the classification of endoscopes, and you mentioned this from semi-critical to critical. Do you have an ETA on that, and do you think that that will actually happen? So if I had to be a betting man, I think that there's a fair chance that that will happen. Whether or not that will change FDA is a different story, because remember that FDA is the regulatory approval body that has approved those devices that are on the market. So if they're already approved and they're already approved as a semi-critical device with high-level disinfection as their validated reprocessing step, it doesn't really matter too much what the AAMI standards say, because they can't supersede the manufacturer's instructions for use. Right now, that can certainly change future device development, as well as things that go back through the FDA for revisions. But I think it's going to be not a one-size-fits-all clarification. Now, the other piece that I'll add to this, and this is just more my personal view, is that the reason this whole conversation is coming up is that there's a known inconsistency with HLD. And sort of the results thereof associated with that, as well as cleaning. And so people are saying, well, if we can't trust HLD, let's just do the next best thing, which is just let's zap the whole scope and actually have a sterile device, right? And even if the scope itself could withstand sterilization, it doesn't mean that it's going to actually get rid of everything. Because if we don't properly pre-clean a device, we don't get rid of all the gross organic soil and bioburden, that scope is still going to be contaminated. It may, have sterile gunk on it, but it's still got gunk, and no patient is going to want that used in them, nor would any of us. And so I think, that's something to think about as well. And then it looks like the last question I have in the queue is, as that relates to COVID, we were told that we could not do procedures because it was simply too risky for us. Is there anything related to disposable devices or devices with filters, particularly HEPA filters, that would help us be safe and allow us to keep doing procedures? So I'm certainly not aware of any approved use of a HEPA filter with GI scopes. That's not something I'm familiar with. But remember that COVID is a very easy to inactivate virus on environmental surfaces. So if we sort of separate out GI, the GI type procedures that you're doing would be very low risk, because they're not going to typically be aerosolizing, organic matter that's going to cause potential for infection. Very different equation if we were talking about bronchoscopy, right, where everything they're doing is aerosolizing. So again, I don't think there's any need to have any type of filter. And if you're doing a good job with HLD, that will take care of COVID. Or certainly if you're using a disposable, like you mentioned, that's also going to eliminate that, because you're throwing it in the trash. But there's no change to any of our conventional reprocessing strategies that we have to do related to COVID. As it relates to medical devices. So, we're pretty fortunate in that sense that it's not affected that world. But I certainly hear the concern, especially related to reprocessing personnel, that they need to have the appropriate PPE also. All right. So it looks like that is all of the questions that I have in my queue. That concludes my portion of this evening's program. I believe the team at AMU, who was kind enough to sponsor this evening's program, is going to take it from here. So Will and Dave, I'll turn it back over to you and let you guys take the rest of the evening away. It was very nice to meet each of you, and I hope everybody has a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Dr. Garrett.